long before his name became synonymous with violence and bloodshed, long before warriors would invoke him on battlefields across the ancient world, long before philosophers would debate whether his existence represented something necessary or something terrible about the human condition, there was a god born into the highest household of the Greek pantheon who would spend his entire eternal existence being despised by his own family. His name was Ares, and his story is perhaps the most tragic of all the Olympian gods, not because he suffered great loss or experienced impossible trials, but because he was hated from the moment of his birth by the very beings who should have loved him most. He was the son of Zeus and Hera, the king and queen of the gods themselves, the most powerful divine couple in all of existence. By every measure of divine politics and inheritance, his birth should have been celebrated. He was a legitimate child of the royal household, not one of Zeus's countless illegitimate offspring born from affairs with mortal women or lesser goddesses. He was raised in the highest halls of Mount Olympus, surrounded by the wealth and power of the divine elite. And yet, from the moment he could understand the world around him, Ares understood that he was not welcome in it. Zeus, his father, looked upon him with barely disguised contempt. The king of the gods, who had countless other children, Athena born from his head, Apollo and Artemis born from Leto, Hermes born from Maia, Dionysus born from his thigh, treated each of these other children with at least some measure of fatherly pride. But Ares, his legitimate son, received only Zeus's disdain. Of all the gods who hold Olympus, Zeus would say openly, in front of other deities, in front of Ares himself, "You are the most hateful to me. You delight only in strife, war, and battles. You have your mother's intolerable, unyielding spirit, and I can barely control her either." These were not words spoken in private fatherly correction. These were public declarations, made at divine gatherings where all the other gods could hear them. Zeus would mock Ares openly, would dismiss his contributions, would treat him as though he were not a fellow god, but rather an embarrassment that the king had been forced to accept as part of his marital obligations to Hera. And Hera, his mother. Hera was perhaps even more complicated in her treatment of her son. She loved him, in the possessive and demanding way that Hera loved anything she considered to be her own property. But her love came tangled with disappointment, with the constant comparison to his half-siblings, with the bitter awareness that her own legitimate child was considered the least impressive of Zeus's many offspring. Ares grew up in this environment of constant disapproval. He was strong, even as a young god, strong in ways that even other immortals had to acknowledge. His body was powerful and well-formed. His reflexes were faster than nearly any other deity. His capacity for combat, for understanding the chaos and rhythm of warfare, was unmatched among the gods of Olympus. But these talents, which should have earned him respect, instead earned him only further scorn. Because the other gods, Zeus most of all, valued different things. They valued cleverness, like Athena's strategic brilliance. They valued artistry, like Apollo's music and prophecy. They valued cunning, like Hermes's silver tongue. They valued majesty, like Zeus's own thunderous authority. They valued any number of qualities that Ares simply did not possess in great measure. What Ares possessed was something more primal, more direct, more immediate. He understood violence. He understood combat. He understood the visceral reality of two warriors meeting on a battlefield with weapons in their hands, and the question of which one would walk away alive. He understood the roar of an army charging into battle, the clash of metal against metal, the spray of blood and the screams of dying men. And in the polite, civilized halls of Olympus, where the gods preferred to discuss philosophy and arrange complex schemes against one another, this kind of understanding was considered crude, barbaric, beneath the dignity of true divinity. Athena, his sister, embodied everything that Ares was not, and the contrast between them would define much of his existence. Athena was also a deity associated with warfare, but her approach to it was entirely different from her brothers. She was the goddess of strategic warfare, of tactical thinking, of using military force as one tool among many in the pursuit of larger civilizational goals. She valued cities, laws, civilization, the careful planning that turned warfare into a means of achieving political ends rather than an end in itself. Ares was the opposite. He was the god of warfare in its rawest, most direct form, the visceral chaos of actual combat, the bloodthirsty rage that overtook warriors in the heat of battle, the destructive energy that warfare unleashed regardless of what political goals it was supposed to serve. He represented warfare not as a tool of statecraft, but as the terrible reality that occurred when statecraft failed. The other gods preferred Athena's version of warfare. It was cleaner, more refined, more compatible with their sense of themselves as civilized beings who could appreciate the necessity of conflict without being personally invested in its brutality. Athena's warfare was warfare you could discuss at a feast without making the other guests uncomfortable. Ares's warfare was the reality you tried to forget about when the actual fighting was happening. And so the gods showed Athena their respect, included her in their councils, sought her advice on important matters. They consigned Ares to the margins, useful when fighting actually had to occur, but otherwise an embarrassment to be tolerated rather than celebrated. Even in the realm of warfare itself, Ares was constantly being defeated by Athena. Their conflicts were legendary among the gods, and the pattern of those conflicts was consistent. Ares would charge forward with raw power and battle fury, and Athena would defeat him through clever strategy and tactical superiority. Time and again, the goddess of strategic warfare would humiliate her brother, would prove that intelligence triumphed over mere strength, would demonstrate that civilized warfare was superior to barbaric chaos. These defeats stung Ares deeply, though he learned over time to hide his pain. To express hurt would only invite more mockery. To complain about being treated unfairly would only confirm his reputation as the inferior god of the two warrior siblings. So he absorbed the humiliations in silence, channeled his frustration into the only outlet he was permitted: the actual battlefields of the mortal world, where at least mortals appreciated what he had to offer. Because Ares discovered, early in his existence, that mortals understood him better than gods did. When he descended to the mortal world during times of war, when he walked among the soldiers preparing for battle, he found something he never found on Olympus: respect, appreciation, even genuine devotion. Warriors prayed to him before battle. Generals invoked his name when calling their armies to courage. Cities throughout the Greek world built temples in his honor. The mortals understood what the gods did not: that warfare was sometimes necessary, that combat required its own kind of skill and courage, that the warrior who actually had to face death on a battlefield needed something different from what philosophers needed in their academies or what merchants needed in their markets. Ares became, in the mortal world, a beloved patron of soldiers and warriors. They saw in him a god who understood their lives, who shared their experiences, who would walk beside them when they had to face the terrible reality of armed combat. In the war-torn regions of the ancient world, Thrace especially, where he was particularly honored, Ares was worshipped with genuine devotion that he never received in his own home on Olympus. And so a pattern emerged in his existence: ignored or mocked on Olympus, but genuinely revered in the mortal world. Dismissed by his family, but loved by warriors. Defeated by Athena in their divine conflicts, but successful in inspiring courage in actual battles fought by actual soldiers. This pattern would define his entire eternal existence. It was during these descents to the mortal world that Ares first encountered Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty. Their meeting would change both of their lives, would create one of the most famous and most scandalous affairs in all of Greek mythology, would produce children whose names would echo through the ages. Aphrodite was, by every measure, the most beautiful being in all of existence. She had been born from sea foam, had emerged from the ocean fully formed and impossibly radiant, had been welcomed into the Olympian pantheon with universal admiration. Every god desired her. Every mortal man who saw her was reduced to helpless longing. Her beauty was so profound that it caused wars, started feuds, and reshaped the lives of everyone she encountered. She had been married, against her will, to Hephaestus, the god of fire and the forge, the lame and unattractive smith god, the deity whose physical appearance was the opposite of everything Aphrodite represented. The marriage had been arranged by Zeus, partly as a way to diffuse the potential conflicts that would have erupted among all the gods who desired Aphrodite, partly as a kind of cruel joke that paired the most beautiful goddess with the least beautiful god. Aphrodite did not love Hephaestus. She fulfilled the duties of marriage to him as required by divine law, but her heart belonged elsewhere, and her body, eventually, belonged to many. When Ares and Aphrodite first encountered each other, the attraction was immediate and powerful. They represented opposite extremes that somehow created perfect complement. He was war, she was love. He was violence, she was passion. He was death, she was the force that brought new life into the world. And yet, despite these opposites, or perhaps because of them, they were drawn to each other with an intensity that neither could resist. They became lovers in secret. They met in hidden places, away from Hephaestus's watchful eye, away from the constant scrutiny of the other gods. Their affair was passionate, intense, all-consuming, in the way that only divine love can be. For a time, the affair brought Ares something he had never experienced before: genuine happiness. Aphrodite did not look at him with the contempt his father showed. She did not compare him unfavorably to his sister Athena. She did not dismiss his nature as crude or barbaric. She saw him for what he was, the god of war, yes, but also a being capable of tenderness, of devotion, of love, and she accepted all of him. In her company, Ares could be more than just the god of bloodshed. He could be a lover, a companion, a being capable of feeling and expressing emotions beyond rage. With Aphrodite, he experienced moments of softness that he could never show on Olympus or on battlefields, moments of vulnerability that would have been mocked if any other god had witnessed them. And the affair produced children, divine children, who would inherit aspects of both parents. There was Eros, the god of desire, who would become one of the most powerful forces in all of existence. There were Phobos and Deimos, the gods of fear and terror, who would accompany their father into every battle. There were Harmonia, the goddess of harmony and accord. And there were others: Anteros, the god of requited love; Himeros, the god of sexual desire. Each of these children inherited some combination of love and violence, of passion and aggression, of the contradictory forces that defined the union of their parents. They represented, in their various ways, the truth that Aphrodite and Ares had stumbled upon in their forbidden love. That love and violence were not as separate as the civilized world wanted to pretend. That passion contained within itself the seeds of both creation and destruction. That the forces of love and war were intimately connected in ways that the gods of Olympus preferred not to acknowledge. But the affair could not remain secret forever. Helios, the sun god whose chariot crossed the sky each day and who saw everything that happened in the daylight world, witnessed the two lovers meeting in secret. He saw them embracing, saw the passion of their stolen moments, saw the truth of what they were doing behind Hephaestus's back. And Helios, who had his own grudges against Aphrodite for various complicated reasons, decided to expose the affair. He went to Hephaestus and told him everything: when the lovers met, where they met, how they conducted their secret relationship. Hephaestus, despite his physical limitations, was perhaps the most clever craftsman in all of existence. When he heard about his wife's betrayal, when he understood that she had been carrying on an affair with Ares of all gods, he did not react with simple rage. Instead, he set about crafting a trap so brilliant, so cunning, that it would expose the lovers in a way they could never escape from, and would humiliate them in front of all the gods. He worked in his forge for days, crafting a net of impossibly fine bronze, woven so finely that it was nearly invisible, yet so strong that nothing could break it. The net was a masterpiece of metallurgy, combining the strength of metal with the suppleness of silk, designed to drop instantly upon command and trap whoever lay beneath it. He attached this net above his marriage bed, hidden among the canopy supports, invisible to anyone who did not know to look for it. And then he announced that he was leaving for a trip to Lemnos, one of his sacred islands, where he would be tending to important work for several days. It was a trap, and Aphrodite and Ares walked directly into it. The moment Hephaestus appeared to depart, Aphrodite sent word to Ares that her husband was gone, that they could finally meet openly in her bedchamber rather than in their usual hidden locations. Ares came eagerly, his desire for Aphrodite as strong as ever, his caution overcome by the apparent safety of the situation. They came together in the marriage bed. They embraced. They became lost in each other's presence, as they had so many times before, and then the net dropped. In an instant, both gods found themselves trapped, caught in the impossibly fine bronze mesh, unable to move, unable to free themselves no matter how they struggled. The net had been crafted by Hephaestus's divine skill, designed specifically to hold even gods, and there was no escaping it. Hephaestus, who had never actually left for Lemnos, but had been watching for the lovers to take the bait, emerged from his hiding place. He called out to all the gods of Olympus, summoning them to witness the betrayal of his marriage, demanding that they see for themselves what his wife and her lover had been doing. The gods came. They gathered around the trapped pair, peering down at the two naked deities tangled together in Hephaestus's net. And rather than expressing sympathy or anger on Hephaestus's behalf, they began to laugh. The laughter spread through the assembled gods like wildfire. Zeus laughed, Apollo laughed, Hermes laughed, and reportedly said something to the effect that he would gladly trade places with Ares despite the humiliation, just for the chance to be with Aphrodite. Even the goddesses, who might have been expected to show some solidarity with Aphrodite's situation, found themselves caught up in the absurdity of the spectacle. For Ares, this was perhaps the deepest humiliation of his entire existence. Not because he was caught in the affair, though that was bad enough, but because he was being publicly mocked by the very family that had spent his entire eternal life dismissing and disrespecting him. The laughter of the gods confirmed everything he had always suspected, that he was a figure of fun to them, that his pain and his desires and his attempts at love were considered humorous rather than worthy of respect. When Hephaestus finally released the net, when the gods continued laughing as Ares and Aphrodite escaped from their humiliating trap, Ares fled to Thrace, to the mortal lands where he was actually respected, where he could escape from the mocking laughter of his own family. And Aphrodite, equally humiliated, retreated to her own sanctuaries, though she would continue her affair with Ares despite the public exposure. The love between them was too strong to be ended by mere humiliation, and they would continue to meet, more carefully now, for centuries to come. But the incident had taught Ares something important about his place in the divine order. He would never truly belong on Olympus, no matter how legitimate his birth or how powerful his nature. He was tolerated, but not respected. He was useful when needed, but otherwise considered an embarrassment. The gods would always prefer Athena's version of warfare to his own, and they would always find ways to mock and diminish him whenever the opportunity arose. This understanding shaped much of how Ares conducted himself in the centuries that followed. He spent more time in the mortal world, where he was actually appreciated. He developed his connections with the warriors and peoples who genuinely worshipped him. He found his place not in the polite halls of Olympus, but on the battlefields where his nature could be expressed without apology or shame. And it was on those battlefields, during the centuries between the affair with Aphrodite and the great events of the Trojan War, that Ares would experience some of the most defining moments of his eternal existence. The centuries that followed the affair with Aphrodite saw Ares retreating more and more from Olympian society and immersing himself in the mortal world of warfare and combat. If his family would not respect him, if his fellow gods would only mock him, then he would find his purpose among those who actually understood what he represented. He became a familiar presence on battlefields across the ancient world. Wherever armies clashed, wherever cities fell to siege, wherever warriors prepared for combat that might end their lives, Ares could be found, sometimes invisible, sometimes manifesting in his full divine glory, always feeding on the energy of warfare itself. For Ares did feed on warfare. It sustained him, energized him, gave him purpose in ways that nothing else could. The clash of weapons, the screams of dying men, the the chaos of armies meeting in combat. These were not horrors to him, but rather the elements of his natural environment, the medium through which he existed most fully. This was not because Ares was cruel by nature. It was because warfare was his domain, and gods drew their strength from their domains. Just as Poseidon was strongest in the depths of the sea, just as Apollo was at his most powerful when prophecy and music filled the air, Ares was at his fullest, most divine self when surrounded by the violence of armed conflict. But this hunger for warfare also created a complicated relationship with the mortals who worshipped him. Ares loved them in his way. They were the only beings who genuinely appreciated him, who saw in him a god worth respecting. But he also needed their wars to continue, needed their conflicts to provide him with the divine energy that sustained him. This contradiction would never be fully resolved. Ares could not stop wanting peace for those he loved, and he could not stop needing war for his own divine sustenance. The mortal world provided endless opportunities for Ares to exercise his nature. Civilizations rose and fell, kingdoms expanded and contracted, alliances formed and dissolved, and in every conflict, in every war, Ares found his presence required and welcomed. He developed favorites among the various warlike peoples of the ancient world. The Thracians, who lived in the wild lands to the north of Greece, were his most devoted worshippers. They built temples to him that were stained with the blood of countless sacrifices. They named their festivals in his honor. They went to war wearing armor decorated with his symbols, believing that his divine presence would carry them to victory. The Spartans, those famously disciplined warriors of the Greek peninsula, also held Ares in particular regard. While they technically worshipped Athena as well, their actual practice of warfare was much closer to what Ares represented than to what his more refined sister embodied. The Spartans were direct, brutal, and uncompromising in combat, qualities that aligned perfectly with the god of war's own nature. And the Amazons, those legendary warrior women who lived in the lands beyond the civilized world, claimed Ares as their direct ancestor, believing themselves descended from his union with various nymphs and minor goddesses. They were perhaps his most fervent worshippers, women who had built an entire society around warfare and combat, who saw in Ares not just a god, but a divine patriarch from whom they drew their strength and their identity. Among all these warrior peoples, Ares moved with the comfort of a god who had finally found his place. He inspired their courage. He guided their hands in battle. He took pleasure in their victories and mourned their losses with genuine grief. They were his true children, in a way that his actual divine offspring with Aphrodite were not. Children of his spirit, warriors who carried his essence into the mortal world. But Ares also experienced something during these centuries that complicated his relationship with warfare. He experienced defeat. Not just defeat at the hands of Athena in their divine conflicts, but actual defeat in mortal battles, on mortal battlefields, by mortal heroes who somehow managed to overcome even a god. The first such defeat came at the hands of Heracles. Heracles, the great mortal hero, who was also the son of Zeus, had been performing his famous labors when he found himself in conflict with one of Ares's sons, a brutish man named Cycnus, who was robbing pilgrims on their way to a sacred shrine. Heracles, with his characteristic directness, decided to put an end to Cycnus's banditry and challenged him to single combat. Ares, learning that his son was about to face the great Heracles, descended to the mortal world to protect his offspring. The battle that ensued was epic by any measure. 3 combatants on a mortal battlefield, 2 of them sons of Zeus, all of them possessed of supernatural strength and skill. Heracles, with the guidance of Athena who appeared to assist him, killed Cycnus in single combat, and then he turned his attention to Ares himself. The god of war and the great hero clashed on the battlefield in a confrontation that few mortals had ever witnessed, and even fewer had survived to describe. Ares, in his rage at his son's death, attacked Heracles with all the divine fury he possessed. But Heracles was no ordinary mortal. He was the son of Zeus, blessed with strength that approached the divine, trained by every great teacher available in the ancient world. The battle ended with Heracles wounding Ares, wounding him so seriously that the god of war was forced to retreat to Olympus to heal. It was a humiliation that the gods on Olympus would never let him forget. To be defeated in single combat by a mortal, even a half-divine mortal like Heracles, was unprecedented and shameful. But it was not the only such defeat Ares would experience in his long existence. He was also wounded by Diomedes during the Trojan War, an incident we will return to. He was tricked and bound by the giants Otus and Ephialtes, who managed to imprison him in a bronze jar for 13 months, a humiliation that ended only when Hermes finally rescued him after his absence had grown impossible to ignore. These defeats and humiliations would have broken a lesser god. They would have driven a different deity to abandon his domain, to seek refuge in something safer or more dignified. But Ares simply absorbed them, accepted them, continued his work despite them, because he understood something that the gods who mocked him did not understand. Warfare was not about always winning. Warfare was about the willingness to face conflict, to engage with danger, to risk yourself for what you believed in. The warrior who never lost was not a warrior at all. That was a tyrant or a coward who only fought when victory was certain. The true warrior fought when fighting was necessary, regardless of whether victory could be guaranteed. And so Ares fought on, despite his defeats. He continued to inspire warriors. He continued to walk among mortal battlefields. He continued to be himself, even when being himself meant accepting that he would never receive the respect he might have deserved. Then came the war that would define an age and would test every god in the Greek pantheon, the Trojan War. When Helen was abducted by Paris of Troy, when the kings of Greece gathered their forces to retrieve her, when the great expedition set sail for the distant city on the coast of Asia Minor, all the gods of Olympus took sides in the conflict. The war became not just a mortal affair, but a divine battlefield where the various deities backed their favored cities and warriors. Athena sided with the Greeks, so did Hera and Poseidon, and a host of other gods who had reasons to want Troy destroyed. Ares, perhaps inevitably, sided with the Trojans. Part of this was simple opposition to Athena. Wherever his sister stood, Ares often took the opposite position purely out of spite and ancient rivalry. Part of it was his affair with Aphrodite, who fiercely supported the Trojans because her son Aeneas was among their warriors, and because Paris had judged her the fairest goddess in the contest that had ultimately started the entire war. But part of it was also genuine sympathy for the Trojans themselves. They were a great warrior people, brave and skilled, defending their city against an overwhelming invasion. Ares could appreciate the position they were in, facing a war they had not entirely chosen, defending what they had built, asked to demonstrate courage against impossible odds. These were warriors he could love. This was a cause he could support. So Ares descended to the battlefields of Troy and fought alongside the Trojan forces. He did not always manifest in his full divine form. To do so would have been to overwhelm the mortal warriors entirely, to make the battle no longer a battle, but simply a divine intervention. Instead, he often fought invisibly alongside particular Trojan champions, lending them his strength and his divine fury, guiding their weapons to find Greek targets. His most direct involvement came during a particular phase of the war, when the Trojans were on the offensive, pushing the Greeks back toward their ships, threatening to break the siege entirely and drive the Greek forces into the sea. It was during this phase that Ares encountered Diomedes and experienced one of the most embarrassing moments of his entire existence. Diomedes was one of the greatest of the Greek warriors, second only to Achilles in skill and courage. During this phase of the war, he was protected by Athena, who had appeared to him and given him the ability to see through the disguises that gods often used when intervening in mortal battles. With this divine sight, Diomedes could see which warriors were actually gods in disguise. He had already wounded Aphrodite earlier in the day, driving her from the battlefield when she came to rescue her son Aeneas. The goddess of love had fled in tears, her divine blood, ichor, staining her robes as she retreated to Olympus. When Ares descended to the battlefield to take more direct action in support of the Trojans, Diomedes saw him for what he was, And under the guidance of Athena, who appeared beside him invisibly to give him strength and skill that no mortal should possess, Diomedes did something unprecedented. He charged at Ares directly. The mortal hero and the god of war met in combat on the plains of Troy. Diomedes' spear, guided by Athena's hand, struck Ares in the side, a wound that should have been impossible for any mortal weapon to inflict on a god. Ares roared in pain, a sound so terrible, so loud, that it was said to have equaled the combined battle cry of 10,000 warriors. The sound shook the entire battlefield. Warriors on both sides paused in their fighting, turning to see what god had been wounded. And Ares, wounded and humiliated for the second time in his existence by a mortal hero, fled the battlefield. He ascended to Olympus, his blood, divine ichor, flowing from his wound. He came before Zeus to complain about what had happened, demanding that his father do something about the situation, demanding that Athena be punished for her interference in mortal affairs. Zeus's response was perhaps the cruelest moment of Ares' eternal existence with his family. The king of the gods looked at his wounded son with absolute contempt. He listened to Ares' complaints with visible distaste. And then he spoke words that revealed exactly how he saw his son, and exactly how little he valued him. "Do not sit beside me and complain, you two-faced hypocrite. Of all the gods who hold Olympus, I hate you the most. You delight only in strife, war, and battles. You have your mother's intolerable, unyielding spirit. I can barely control her either. I think you suffer because of her advice. But I will not allow you to suffer further, since you are my own offspring and your mother bore you to me. If you had been born of any other god as treacherous as yourself, you would have been thrown down lower than the children of Uranus long ago." These were the words Zeus spoke to his wounded son. Not comfort, not concern, not even basic familial sympathy. Instead, he confirmed what Ares had always known, that his own father considered him the most hateful of all the gods, that he was tolerated only because of his mother's intervention, that he had no real place in the family that had created him. Zeus did order that Ares be healed by Paeon, the divine physician of the gods. But there was no warmth in the order, no comfort in the words, no acknowledgement that Ares had been wounded in battle while doing what gods were supposed to do, defend the causes they believed in. After he was healed, Ares returned to Olympus, but he was changed by the experience, not because of the physical wound that healed quickly enough, but because of his father's words. He had finally heard, in the most explicit possible terms, exactly what Zeus thought of him. There could be no more pretending that he was simply misunderstood, or that his father might come to appreciate him in time. Zeus hated him, and Zeus would always hate him, and there was nothing Ares could do to change that fundamental fact. The Trojan War continued without Ares' direct intervention for some time after this incident. He remained on Olympus, brooding, processing what his father had said to him. He watched the war from above, seeing the Trojans struggle without his direct support, seeing the Greeks gain ground under Athena's continued favour. But eventually, his nature reasserted itself. He could not stay away from warfare for long. It was his domain, his sustenance, his reason for existing. He descended back to the battlefields, more cautious this time, less willing to manifest in his full divine form, but still present, still influencing the conflict, still doing what only the god of war could do. It was during the later phases of the war that one of the most personally devastating events of Ares' existence occurred: the death of his son, Ascalaphus. Ares had many divine children, but Ascalaphus was one of the few who fought as a mortal warrior on the side of the Trojans. He was a leader of the minions, a great warrior in his own right, and he had inherited from his divine father a love of combat and a particular skill with weapons. When Ascalaphus was killed in battle by one of the Greek warriors, the news reached Ares on Olympus, and Ares, for the first time perhaps in his entire existence, broke down in genuine grief. He had not been a particularly attentive father to his many children. The obligations of a god rarely permitted close fatherly relationships. But Ascalaphus had been special to him. The boy had embodied so many of the qualities Ares valued: courage, directness, the willingness to face combat without flinching. To lose him was to lose someone who had genuinely represented what Ares stood for. The god of war prepared his weapons. He prepared his chariot. He prepared to descend to the battlefield and exact vengeance for his son's death, to kill so many Greek warriors that the river running through the battlefield would turn red with their blood, to make the Greeks pay for what they had taken from him. But Athena intercepted him, his sister, his great rival, the goddess who had defeated and humiliated him so many times throughout his existence, came to him in his moment of grief and rage. She spoke to him with surprising gentleness, not the contemptuous tone she usually used, but something approaching genuine compassion. She reminded him of Zeus's edict that the gods were not to intervene directly in the war during certain phases. She reminded him that the deaths of mortal children, even divine offspring, were ultimately part of the mortal experience that gods could not entirely prevent. She reminded him that to descend to the battlefield in his current state of grief would be to invite further humiliation, further conflict with Zeus, further confirmation of everything their father had said about him. And surprisingly, Ares listened. He set aside his weapons. He returned to his chambers. He grieved for his son in private, away from the mocking eyes of the other gods. It was perhaps the first time that Athena had ever shown him anything resembling sisterly concern. And it was perhaps the first time that Ares had ever accepted her guidance without resistance. This moment of unexpected connection between the two warrior siblings did not erase their ancient rivalry. They would continue to oppose each other on countless future occasions. They would continue to represent fundamentally different approaches to warfare. They would continue to clash whenever their different visions came into conflict. But for one brief moment, in the depths of Ares's grief for his lost son, there was something between them that might have been called family. The recognition that despite all their differences, they shared something fundamental about their nature as warrior gods, that they understood things about combat and death that no other deity could fully understand. And then the war continued, and life on Olympus resumed its usual patterns, and Ares went back to being the despised son and brother who happened to also be the god of war. As the centuries passed, and the ancient world transformed through cycles of war and peace, of empire and collapse, Ares continued his eternal existence, sometimes visible on battlefields, sometimes retreating to Olympus to brood, always present wherever armed conflict occurred among mortals. But his place in the divine order was being slowly transformed by forces that had nothing to do with his own actions. The way mortals understood the gods was changing. The way they thought about warfare was evolving. The way they assigned divine responsibility for the various aspects of human life was shifting in ways that would profoundly affect how Ares was remembered and worshipped. The Greeks, for all that they relied on warriors and warfare for their survival and expansion, had always maintained a complicated relationship with the god of war. They worshipped him, yes, built temples to him, made sacrifices in his name, invoked him before battles. But they also feared him, distrusted him, viewed him with the same ambivalence that they viewed war itself. This ambivalence was reflected in the philosophical traditions that emerged from Greek civilization. Philosophers like Plato and Aristotle wrote about warfare as something that should be approached with caution and reluctance, as a tool of last resort, rather than a celebration of human achievement. The god who represented warfare in its rawest form became, in their writings, a symbol of the irrationality and chaos that civilized people should strive to overcome. This was not how Ares had been seen in earlier ages. In the heroic age, when warriors like Achilles and Diomedes had walked the earth, when warfare was seen as a noble calling that revealed the highest qualities of human character, Ares had been celebrated more openly. But as Greek civilization matured, as cities grew and developed sophisticated political and philosophical traditions, the direct worship of warfare itself became something embarrassing, something that civilized people should pretend was less important than it actually was. Athena's worship grew during these centuries. Her form of warfare, strategic, controlled, integrated with civilization, was seen as superior to Ares's chaotic battlefield fury. Temples to Athena multiplied across the Greek world. Cities adopted her as their patron deity, named themselves after her, identified their civic identity with her qualities. Meanwhile, the temples to Ares grew quieter. They were still maintained, still received occasional sacrifices, but they were no longer the center of civic life that they had been in earlier ages. He became a god people invoked only when absolutely necessary, when their cities were under attack, when they had to send their sons to war, and forgot about during the longer periods of peace. Ares understood what was happening. He could see the shift in how he was perceived, could feel the diminishment of his worship, could recognize that the civilized world was trying to pretend he did not exist whenever possible. But he also knew something that the philosophers writing their treatises did not want to acknowledge. Warfare did not actually go away just because civilized people preferred not to talk about it. Wars continued to be fought. Armies continued to clash. Young men continued to die on battlefields. The reality that Ares represented continued to be a fundamental part of human existence, no matter how much sophisticated people might wish otherwise. He was simply being asked to be the god of an aspect of life that everyone wanted to benefit from, but no one wanted to honor publicly. The cities that grew rich through conquest, the empires that expanded through military force, the heroes who were celebrated for their victories in battle, all of them depended on what Ares represented. But they preferred to give credit to Athena's strategy, or Zeus's blessing, or their own civilized virtues, rather than acknowledging the raw violence that had actually made their successes possible. It was a kind of hypocrisy that would have offended any god, but it offended Ares particularly because it confirmed what his family had always thought of him. He was useful, but embarrassing. Necessary, but not respectable. The god whose work made civilization possible, but who could not be invited to civilization's dinner parties. When Rome rose to dominate the Mediterranean world, when Greek civilization was absorbed into the Roman Empire, when the Greek gods were given Roman names and adopted into Roman religion, something interesting happened to Ares. The Romans, who were perhaps the most successful warrior people the ancient world had ever produced, did not share the Greek ambivalence about warfare. They embraced military conquest as central to their identity, celebrated their generals as the highest figures in their society, built an entire empire on the foundation of effective military force. And the Romans, when they adopted Ares as their god Mars, treated him with a respect and reverence that the Greeks had never quite managed. Mars became, for the Romans, one of the most important gods in their pantheon, second perhaps only to Jupiter himself. They built magnificent temples to him at the heart of Rome. They named the month of March after him, the month traditionally associated with the beginning of the military campaign season. They considered him the divine ancestor of Romulus and Remus, the founders of Rome, making him not just a god they worshipped, but a god from whom they claimed direct descent. For the first time in his existence, Ares, now called Mars by his worshippers, received the kind of respect that he had always deserved but never received from his Greek devotees. Roman warriors went into battle invoking his name with genuine pride, not embarrassed apology. Roman generals dedicated their victories to him with full ceremonial honors. Roman society organized itself around military values in ways that the Greeks had never quite done. This Roman adoption of Mars represented something like vindication for the god who had spent so many centuries being dismissed by his own family on Olympus. The Romans understood what the Greeks had always tried to deny, that warfare was not a regrettable necessity, but a central part of human civilization, that the warrior virtues were genuinely admirable rather than embarrassing, that the god of war deserved to be honored without apology or qualification. Of course, this Roman vindication came with its own complications. Mars, as the Romans understood him, was not entirely the same god as the Greek Ares. The Romans emphasized different aspects of his character, focused on different stories about him, integrated him into their cultural framework in ways that transformed how he was perceived. The Mars who was worshipped at the heart of Rome was, in some sense, a different deity from the Ares who had been mocked on Olympus. But underneath these cultural variations, the same divine being persisted, the same god of warfare, of armed conflict, of the violent reality that human civilizations could not escape. He continued to exist, continued to receive worship, continued to be invoked by warriors going into battle, and eventually, even the Roman version of his worship faded. The empire that had celebrated him so enthusiastically collapsed. Christianity rose to replace the old pagan religions, and the gods of Olympus, including Mars/Ares, were officially demoted to the status of demons or mere mythology. The temples were torn down or repurposed. The sacrifices ended. The worship that had sustained him through countless ages came to an end. But did Ares cease to exist? This was the question that lingered in the philosophical traditions that followed the end of pagan worship. The Christians would say yes, that the gods of the old religions had been false all along, that they had never truly existed except as delusions or demonic deceptions, that the rise of Christianity had revealed the truth, and the old gods had simply faded away because they had never been real. But others would argue differently. They would point out that warfare continued, that armies continued to clash, that the qualities Ares had represented, the courage and fury and direct engagement with combat that defined the warrior's experience, continued to manifest in every soldier who marched into battle, in every general who planned a campaign, in every people who took up arms to defend or expand their territory. If Ares represented something essentially true about human existence, these voices argued, then he could not simply be banished by changing religious traditions. He might be called different names. He might be honored or denied in different ways. But the reality he represented, the reality of warfare as a fundamental aspect of human civilization, would continue regardless. And so Ares persisted, in a sense, through all the centuries that followed the end of his formal worship. He was there in every medieval battle between knights, every clash between empires expanding through Europe and Asia, every revolutionary conflict that overthrew old governments and established new ones. He was there in the great world wars of the modern era, when entire generations of young men were sent to their deaths in conflicts of unprecedented scale. He was there in every smaller war, every conflict between nations or factions or peoples, every armed struggle that occurred anywhere in the world. He persisted because what he represented persisted. Human beings continued to make war on each other. The reality that he embodied continued to be a part of human existence. And as long as that was true, he could not truly be banished, no matter what religious or philosophical traditions tried to deny him. Modern psychology and philosophy have approached Ares from yet another angle. Some thinkers have suggested that he represents something essential in the human psyche: the capacity for aggression, the willingness to engage in violent conflict, the qualities that make organized warfare possible. These thinkers have argued that this capacity, while often destructive, is also necessary, that human beings without the capacity for righteous anger or defensive aggression would be unable to protect themselves or what they value. In this view, Ares is not simply the god of warfare in a literal sense, but the divine representation of an aspect of human nature itself. He is the part of us that becomes angry when injustice occurs, the part that is willing to fight to protect those we love, the part that recognizes when peaceful means have failed and more direct action becomes necessary. This understanding offers something like rehabilitation for the god who was hated by his own family. If Ares represents necessary human qualities, qualities without which civilizations could not survive and individuals could not protect themselves, then perhaps the contempt his family showed him on Olympus was not justified. Perhaps they were trying to deny something about themselves that they did not want to acknowledge, just as civilized societies have so often tried to deny their dependence on warfare. Perhaps Ares was hated not because he was actually contemptible, but because he forced everyone else to confront aspects of existence they would have preferred to ignore. This reading of his story transforms how we might understand his eternal tragedy. He was not despised because he was lesser than the other gods. He was despised because he represented uncomfortable truths that the other gods, and the mortals who worshipped them, preferred not to face directly. His marginalization was not justice, but rather a form of collective denial, a refusal to honor what made civilization possible, because honoring it would require acknowledging things that polite society wanted to forget. In this light, Ares becomes a tragic figure, not because of what was done to him by hostile forces, but because of what was done to him by the very civilizations he made possible. He was the god whose work everyone depended on, but whose contribution everyone preferred to deny. The Greeks themselves seem to recognize this paradox in some of their most ancient stories. Even as they portrayed Ares as the despised son, the lesser warrior god compared to Athena, the embarrassing presence on Olympus, they also acknowledged that wars could not be won without him, that warriors needed his presence on their side, that no city could survive without honoring him in some way. His temples, even in the centuries when his worship was declining, remained important during times of military crisis. His name was invoked before every battle, even by people who would deny his significance during peacetime. His symbols, the spear, the shield, the helmet, remained central to the visual language of warfare itself. He was, in this sense, the most necessary god to acknowledge precisely when one would most prefer to deny him. The cities that wanted to imagine themselves as purely civilized and refined still needed Ares when their walls were threatened. The philosophers who wrote sophisticated treatises against warfare still depended on warriors trained in Ares's domain to protect their freedom to philosophize. The whole edifice of Greek civilization, with all its art and democracy and intellectual achievement, rested on a foundation of military force that Ares represented. And so we come to the end of Ares's story. Though in truth, his story does not end, because what he represents continues to be part of human existence even today, in every conflict that occurs anywhere in the world, in every warrior who goes into combat, in every act of defensive violence that protects what people value. Ares began his existence as the legitimate son of the king and queen of the gods, born into the highest station in the divine order, possessed of strength and courage that should have made him beloved by his family. And he ended his eternal existence as one of the most consistently disrespected and misunderstood gods in the entire pantheon, despised by his father, complicated in his relationship with his mother, mocked by his fellow gods, and ultimately forgotten when the religions that had grudgingly worshipped him gave way to new traditions that pretended he had never existed at all. But his story is not really about his rejection or his marginalization. It is about something deeper, about the way civilized societies struggle with the realities they depend on but would prefer to deny, about the tension between the violence that makes civilization possible and the peaceful values that civilization tries to embody, about what it means to be necessary but unwanted, essential but unloved. Ares teaches us that some of the most important parts of existence are the parts we are most reluctant to honor openly. The qualities he represented, courage in the face of mortal danger, the willingness to fight when fighting becomes necessary, the visceral engagement with conflict that mere intellectual sophistication cannot replace. These qualities have been essential to human survival throughout history. Yet they have rarely been celebrated by the polite institutions of civilization that depend on them. His story also teaches us about the cost of rejection by those who should love us most. Ares was strong, capable, genuinely committed to his domain. He was not contemptible by any objective measure. Yet his father's contempt shaped him, made him retreat from the divine community that should have welcomed him, drove him to find his worth in mortal battlefields where at least his nature was appreciated. The damage that comes from being despised by one's own family is real, even for gods, and Ares carried that damage throughout his entire eternal existence. There is something deeply tragic about a being whose only crime was being too direct, too honest, too unwilling to pretend that warfare was anything other than what it actually was. The other gods preferred their warfare polished and abstracted, integrated into philosophical discussions about justice and necessity. Ares preferred warfare in its raw reality, the actual clash of warriors on actual battlefields, the actual blood and screams and chaos that warfare actually involves. For this honesty, this refusal to pretend that combat was something more civilized than it actually was, he was punished by his family throughout eternity. He was punished for being what he was, for representing what he represented, for not wrapping his nature in the comfortable euphemisms that the other gods preferred. But Ares endured. He continued to exist, continued to represent what he represented, continued to serve his domain, even when that domain refused to honor him properly. He found his worshippers among the warriors and warlike peoples who needed what he had to offer. He continued to inspire courage in those who faced impossible odds. He continued to be the god of war, regardless of how much the other gods or the philosophers or the civilized cities wished he would simply disappear. And in that endurance, in that refusal to abandon his domain, despite the contempt heaped upon him, there is something genuinely admirable. Something that the Romans recognized when they elevated him to a position of true honor in their pantheon. Something that warriors throughout history have understood when they invoked his name before battle. Ares was the god who could not be reformed into something more palatable, the deity who refused to be civilized into a more acceptable version of himself, the eternal presence in the human story, who insisted on representing what he represented without apology or modification. He was war itself, in its essential reality, and he refused to be anything other than that, even when being that meant being despised by his entire family. He is the god of every soldier who has ever marched into battle, knowing they might not return. He is the god of every people who have ever taken up arms to defend their home or their freedom. He is the god of every parent who has ever sent their child to war, hoping desperately that they would come back alive. He is the god of every warrior whose courage made civilization possible, even when that civilization preferred to deny how much it depended on warriors. He is also, perhaps, the god of everyone who has ever been disrespected by their own family, who has ever been told they were the most hateful child, who has ever endured the slow erosion of self-worth that comes from being constantly compared unfavorably to siblings, who has ever found that the people who should love them most cannot or will not. His story speaks to that universal human experience of rejection by those whose acceptance we most need, of finding our worth in the places where we are actually valued rather than the places where we are supposed to be loved. Ares endured. He persisted. He continued to be himself despite everything that was done to him. And in that persistence, in that unwillingness to disappear no matter how much the world wanted him to, there is something that deserves to be remembered with respect rather than contempt. He was the god of war, hated by his own family, but loved by those who actually needed him. And his story, far from being merely the tale of a tragic god, is the story of how civilization tries and fails to escape from its own foundations. How the things we depend on most are often the things we least want to acknowledge. How the gods we need most are often the gods we treat worst. How the truths we cannot escape are often the truths we most prefer to deny. Ares was war. War remains. And in that continuing reality, the god who was despised on Olympus continues to find his place in the human story, regardless of what names he is called or whether anyone admits that he still matters. He always mattered. He always will. And the world that pretends otherwise is the world that has forgotten its own foundations. But the foundations remain, whether the world remembers them or not.